for the record, I grew up around here too. And it's good to be back. So, first of all, I'll just say that the title of my talk is too long to read. And start with a story. And over a decade ago, I wrote an op-ed piece for the Arizona Republic that started out like this: confronting the dangers of wildfire requires a shift in society, not just more firefighters and better technology. And I went on to say that we needed to drop a lot of the military metaphors that we use and really try to develop a fire-adapted society that would match our fire-adapted forest ecosystems. That was due to run in September of 2001, but before it did, 9/11 happened, and it got relegated to the recycle bin. And the idea that we would change our behavior in order to fit in better with the forest seemed out of step with the times and a little bit quaint and idealistic. So instead, we really invested in gearing up to meet the fire threat. We invested in new technologies, and we opened up the federal treasury to firefighting, and people did an incredible job. I mean, there were big fires, but the loss of life and property could have been much, much worse. And so that's a success story, I think, except that we didn't solve the primary problem. On the ground, practices didn't change that much outside the wildland-urban interface and some of the areas where fire was being used experimentally at landscape scales. And we really haven't yet, over a majority of our forested landscapes, been able to manage at landscape scales. Each year the battles are tougher and more expensive. And I know that I'm not alone when I say that I was really shaken by this past fire season. More than a decade has gone by since I wrote that op-ed. And you know, here we are. March 1st, looking out toward what could be another long, dry spring, another potentially bad fire season, when we're here hoping that we can dodge a bullet one more time. I was asked to give this talk and to think about the socio-political context of restoration and fire management. And so I'm not really going to talk about much ecology. I think there's been a lot, and it's been delivered by the best people in the region, the best people in the world. And so I am going to try and focus on the social aspects to a large extent. And I think right here, this is a choice that we have. Which is going to be our path forward? Is it going to be on the left, fighting big fires and knowing that in the long run we'll likely lose, or moving toward landscapes like the Bright Can panel on the Gila, where we do have fire as a regular part of the landscape, and our society is adapted to live within that fire regime that will keep our forested lands forested over time. So the purpose of my talk really is to examine the socio-political context and to make the case that science is valuable because it can inform, but not just inform, it can also elevate the social discourse. And that really is what enables action. We'd like to think that better science leads to better decisions, but I'm not sure that's true. I am sure that science, when it's shared and communicated well, can lead to a better discussion, and that better decisions sometimes come from that deeper and more heartfelt discourse. I also want to share some ideas about how we can respond to this call for management that's informed by science, shaped by collaboration, and powered by new partnerships between the public and the private sectors. I'm not really going to talk about the regulatory environment, even though it's important, it's complicated, it's changing fast. You know, the new Forest Service planning rule contains some significant departures from the 82 rule. which is still the foundation for how we manage the public forests. I'm not going to really talk about that. I'm not going to talk about the protocols that we use, the precedents that we operate under, or the differences in organizational cultures, even though these are often what determine what happens on the ground, or often what doesn't happen. And I'm not really going to talk about social conflicts directly, even though litigation and the threat or fear of litigation influences our behaviors, and also that we are seeing some of the conflicted parties really stepping forward and trying to move beyond this history. In fact, not talking about them was the way that I was able to work those into the talk. But what I am going to talk more about is this landscape imperative, the fact that increasingly fires operating at scales that dwarf project level management, that's forcing us to think about things at the landscape scale. And that we have to analyze a problem and plan at the scale of the minimum dynamic unit, or however you want to think about it, at a scale that encompasses the disturbance regime. It's a big challenge. And I think sometimes, though, it seems impossible because we can't really act at that scale. We can't go to 1 million acres and do something. We do have to take it one chunk at a time. But taking it one chunk at a time is much more likely to lead to meeting of our objectives if we can think and plan at these broader spatial scales. So you've seen this incredible photo before. Thanks, Craig. I think it's been up 20 or so times in this conference. And so it's kind of reached symbolic status, and that's how I'd like to think about it. We know that there are costs from not acting. The biological costs of reburn, and even some of the single high-intensity burns are devastating. They're not the end of the world. Things grow. There's photosynthesis. There's biodiversity that will come next. But it's not going to be like what we value now over a lot of our landscapes if we don't act. What we often don't think about is that there are also social costs of not acting. And this is an example of an output from a collaborative process in the White Mountains, where a large and diverse group, some of those folks are in the audience now, put a lot of time into prioritizing the landscape based on where high-value features of the landscape were and where those features faced high risk from fire. This was a project in collaboration with the Ecological Restoration Institute, the White Mountain Stewardship Group, the Forest Service, and many others. And it was over in 2005, and that color graphic shows in red the areas that were highly prioritized across that landscape. And the crosshatch area shows the wallow fire. And so I think it indicates that at least there is some value in this collaborative work, that people are able to grasp the issues and they're able to pull out priorities. And I think there's a cost for not acting according to the will of those processes. Costs in terms of cynicism, and perhaps costs in terms of the willingness of society to be patient. We see a lot of political responses already with states trying to assume the responsibilities that are really the responsibilities and the jurisdictions of the federal government. We see increasing calls for privatization of public lands when the perception of mismanagement runs rampant. And I think we need to be aware of those. So I would like to suggest that there are at least four important avenues for increasing responsibility. And I want to think about this really literally in terms of our ability to respond to a situation. thinking of responsibility as the ability to respond. And I suggest that right now we have low responsibility. We recognize a problem. There's compelling science. There are eloquent spokespeople. And there's large public agreement. Yet the response is really slow. And I'd say it's unacceptably slow. So I think we do need to be more responsible. And so one is public engagement and education. And this is more than just consultation or review. I think we really need to engage a much broader section of our society in helping to solve these problems. NEPA analysis and a lot of the ways we approach assessment and analysis needs to be modernized. There are many tools that are underutilized now, and I think they lead often to substandard outcomes. And by adopting more current techniques, I think we can increase the transparency of that analysis and engage more people in these difficult decisions. I think we can improve our ability to implement plans in many ways, speed them up, do them more efficiently, and do them better. And more effective contracting and budgeting mechanisms may be one way to engage the private sector, the non-federal sector, in deeper partnerships and collaborations. And I think that if we're going to act and be more responsible, we need to revitalize a commitment to monitoring and adaptive management, because that's our main means for working effectively in great uncertainty, which I think is inevitable. So, number one, expand the use of collaboration as part of the NEPA process is one way of engaging people and increasing education. The Council on Environmental Quality has provided guidelines for how we can collaboratively develop alternatives, and they claim that those that are developed collaboratively are more likely to withstand external challenges. And collaboration is difficult. Engagement in NEPA is somewhat scary because of FACA and other federal sideboards. We need to be careful, but I think we need to be more ambitious about our ability to engage partners in this collaborative process. And I think that this is a point I made already, that it can elevate the public discourse. Some of these activities can really enlist people to own the strengths of the science and to have greater faith in it, share traditional knowledge and combine that with scientific knowledge so that we can come up with socially viable approaches and solutions. And I think then the gap between the science and the application can be better bridged, and science to most people, most non-researchers, becomes more relevant. It becomes more rational and more understandable. The second one was to think about multi-scale analysis and assessment. And this is a graphic from Steve Cesny, who's done a lot of remote sensing work and developed data products that allow us to analyze problems at different scales. And we can work at this very broad regional scale simultaneously, working at a project level scale, and be able to move seamlessly between these and to make sure that the regional patterns correspond to our landscape objectives and that those objectives correspond to our project level planning and actions. It's practical. We really can do it, but it requires a willingness and an ability to adopt new approaches, to utilize new data sources, and to recruit new partners to guide management. This multi-scale analysis can take the form of spatial models. It can leverage limited field data with remotely sensed data products, providing a synoptic view, scalable representations of things like fire risk in this case, or looking at wildlife populations and their habitat, in this case, occupancy estimates for the northern goshawk across the Mogollon Plateau and up into the Kaibab. We can look at landscape connectivity for wide-ranging organisms at a regional scale. This is work of Brett Dixon's looking at the Grand Canyon region and how pumas might encounter resistance as they move across this vast landscape. So those are a few examples of where I think we're headed, and I think that these techniques and this information is accessible, and we can engage more stakeholders by being creative. The third thing I wanted to talk about is the improving of implementation. And I know this is complicated, and I don't pretend to know very much about it. But I do know that in 2008, when the group that I work with completed this collaboratively developed analysis of the supply of small diameter timber in northern Arizona, there was an expectation that within several months there would be an RFP for a commercial contract to harvest some of that small diameter timber. And at least from the point of view of many people who participated in that analysis, there was a long delay, several long delays. But it has led to an RFP for the forest restoration project. And there were proposals prepared and submitted. And there have been some delays in the awarding of that. And I don't mean to imply that this is easy, but I think it is worthwhile to note that in the current operations, those potential commercial partners have waited years to have the opportunity to join in partnership to achieve this broad consensus, or help achieve this broad consensus for thinning that will allow the restoration of low-intensity fire regimes across the area. We need appropriate mechanisms and authorities to do this more quickly and more efficiently, and it may require congressional action. I can't say that I'm an expert, but I do know that there are things like the cancellation ceiling clause and other things that really restrict what can be done. There probably are some mechanistic things there that need solving, and they may be issues that have to be addressed through the political and regulatory arena. The fourth thing I wanted to talk about was this redoubling of a commitment to monitoring adaptive management. There have been some great talks on this. I don't think I need to repeat any of it. But I do want to make the point that this really is our way of advancing confidently into areas of policy, management, implementation, the socioeconomic dimensions of the problem with some confidence. That in order to capture the advantages that are provided by adaptive management, we have to commit to acting, taking actions that are based on the data. That is, when we cross some pre-established threshold or trigger, we act based on the information from a well-designed monitoring plan. And I guess the point that I wanted to make too is that there is a dissonance created here, because in some ways we tend to think of adaptive management as increasing the discretion. You know, if something's not right, we can identify the problem and we can correct it. But from another perspective, it actually decreases the discretion, because we have to commit to taking an action based on the results of monitoring. We can't decide later, well, I think we'll do something differently. To really capture the ability to operate with confidence in an uncertain environment, we need to embrace adaptive management and commit to this idea that we're going to adjust based on these pre-established triggers that will not allow us broad discretion on what to do, but will direct us in a structured decision-making way to modify the plan, modify the action. So I wanted to just briefly give a local example of how this combination of new analytical approaches, relatively new, applied in a collaborative framework, have been trialed. Now, I'm not promoting this, I'm not saying it's an answer, but it's something that, along with the Forest Guild and the BLM, with the support of the Joint Fire Sciences Project, we a big group, carried out this Northern New Mexico landscape assessment, which was completed in 2006. And we had a very broad group of collaborators that the study area here outlined in red, many of you know, we're sitting in it down here and extending up to the Colorado line, very diverse ownership pattern, and representatives from across the region participated in this process and looked at some of the key landscape values, as I discussed before, and what placed those at risk. And I'm not going to walk through this in any detail, but rather just show a few pictures to give you a flavor of the fact that collaborative process supported by science can lead to very discrete outcomes. In this case, looking at watersheds that supported acequia systems that were of high value to the participants, combined with a map showing the vulnerability of watersheds to post-fire erosion, allowed, along with some other data layers, the development of a fairly explicit map of priority areas. And I'll just say that in addition to that priority map, the group was also able to come up with a map of very general recommended management actions. And in working in a group and mobilizing these data at the service of collaboration, we came up with multiple solutions to these two questions, and that allowed us to actually look at how much agreement there was among the participants in terms of the appropriate actions. So areas here that are in red show very low agreement, while areas in blue show near complete agreement with respect to what an appropriate management intervention might be at that particular location. This is just one example. There are many across the West. They're being refined and trialed, and I think we are, though, at a point where we can engage people in a science-based, deliberative process that really does get to some implementable objectives that are likely to enjoy broad public support. So I wanted to end by saying that I think we're really hesitating, if you will, right now, at a really critical moment. And I think it's good to listen to what people have been saying and are continuing to say. And I just culled 3 comments from this conference. Craig Allen, over the past more or less 150 years, fire regimes have responded sensitively, strongly, and in understandable ways to changes in human land management. I think it's within our power to implement what we think is likely to be change in the right direction. Don Falk said, new models are required both in management and science. One consistent theme in these new models is the imperative to study and manage fire at landscape scales. And last night, Julio identified one of our challenges is that we need to anticipate and manage wildland fire in a changing and non-stationary world. So we really can't really even hang our hat on reconstructing or restoring to a specific case. We're kind of managing as we go and as the world changes around us. But I think we have reason to think that we can do it, or at least that we can move in the right direction. And I think it's up to us to choose. And I'm really not sure which one we will choose. I hope that we'll choose to embrace practical new approaches to forest planning and management that will incorporate the public in a manner that builds support and diffuses conflict, and that we can encourage our leaders and decision makers to adopt bold responses that are appropriately scaled to the social, economic, and ecological challenges that are evident across the region. So thanks, and I'd be happy to take a few questions.